Please begin the daily routine presenting reading petitions. Presenting reports of committees. Tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to table the Cancer Care Newsletter report to the community for the year ending April 2003. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Table. Statements by ministers. Government notice of motion. Introduction of bills. The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 153 of the Acts of 1919, an act to incorporate the Old Presbyterian Church Cemetery Company of Chipman Corner in Cornwallis, Kings County. Thank you.
The Honourable Member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 153 of the Acts of 1999, an act to incorporate the Old Presbyterian Church Cemetery Company of Chipman Corner in Cornwallis, Kings County.
Bill 44, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 153 of the Acts of 1919, an act to incorporate the Old Presbyterian Church Cemetery Company of Chipman Corner in Cornwallis, Kings County.
Or this bill be read a second time at a future date. Notice of motion. Orders of the day, government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, would you please call the order of business public bills for second reading?
Public bills for second reading.
Please call Bill 36, the Financial Measures Act 2003.
Bill number 36. Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to resume debate on the main motion on Bill 36, Mr. Speaker. And with those few remarks, Mr. Speaker, I will move that the previous question be now put and resume my seat.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in my place to speak on the Financial Measures Act, which, as we all know, is a companion piece of legislation to the government's budget. Mr. Speaker, this particular bill does a number of things, and there is at least one thing in this bill that I can support and agree with, Mr. Speaker, and that is the increase in tobacco tax that the government announced back in January, I believe, Mr. Speaker, and when it took effect shortly after they announced it. That particular increase in tobacco tax was I believe, the fifth increase in tax on tobacco products in the mandate of this government. And, Mr. Speaker, we all know that increasing the cost of tobacco has an impact on youth smoking. There's a fair amount of research that demonstrates that the price of tobacco products can be a deterrent to young people taking up the habit. So anything that can contribute to deterring youth is to be supported. However, at the same time, Mr. Speaker, it's worth pointing out that this government has realized a fairly significant increase in revenue into the general accounts as a result of the 5 increases in tobacco tax in this government's mandate. And I have been somewhat disappointed that the government hasn't seen fit to allocate a greater percentage of that revenue for tobacco cessation programs for people who are already addicted to this highly toxic substance. And, Mr. Speaker, you know, I take calls and emails from people, not only in my constituency, but in other constituencies as well. And I've had contact from a number of people, particularly people who are seniors. This government likes to talk about how its focus is on deterring youth from taking up smoking. And while that's a highly commendable objective, I think that it's important to have public policy that's in the interest of all Nova Scotians, not just particular segments of our population. And I have to say that I feel a great deal of empathy for people who have been addicted to tobacco for a very long period of time. Sometimes seniors have been smoking perhaps for 30 or 40 years, and they would really like to quit, but have a very difficult time because of the extent of the tobacco addiction. And the products that are out there, various pharmaceutical type products, cost a fair amount for some people who may be living on fixed incomes with a lot of other demands on those incomes and a lot of pressures. And I've had seniors who have contacted me and asked me why this government doesn't allocate more of the revenue from tobacco taxation to smoking cessation, to provide seniors, for example, with an opportunity to participate in a 12-step type smoking cessation program, in acquiring the pharmaceutical aids that would assist them in smoking or quitting smoking. And they say that something could be established that would allow people a one-time only opportunity to quit smoking. Mr. Speaker, I have a very good friend, a senior who is in my constituency, who will be 86 years of age in June, who is currently in hospital, and she's currently suffering from some illnesses and side effects from having been a smoker for many, many years. And I know through my visits to see her that she has really attempted on her own to quit smoking, and it's been a very, very hard struggle for her. And I think that if we had a greater allocation of the tobacco revenue, and we're talking about literally millions of additional revenue that this government has brought in, but has failed to allocate a sufficient amount for the tobacco strategy. So we will continue to push this government to do the right thing with respect to the tobacco strategy and the allocation of revenues for no smoking programs. Ironically, while you have this provision in the Financial Measures Act to increase tobacco tax, this act also has the provision that will exempt the casino from the municipal bylaws of the Cape Breton Regional Municipality and of the Halifax Regional Municipality, Mr. Speaker. And we, in this caucus, reject entirely that amendment in the Financial Measures Act. And we reject it entirely for a variety of reasons, Mr. Speaker, which we've had an opportunity to discuss in the past week, but are worth putting on the record again, Mr. Speaker. When this government brought in its Smoke-Free Places Act last spring, the casino was granted an exemption from the Smoke-Free Places Act, and we disagreed with the position that the government had taken at that time. And the Minister of Health at that time, the former Minister of Health today, danced around any discussion of the casino contract. Perhaps he hadn't seen the contract and really didn't know. At any rate, he would not engage in a discussion about the contract at that time. Certainly, the people coming before the Law Amendments Committee all raised questions about the exemption for the casino. Other bar and lounge and restaurant operators saw this exemption in the government's legislation as giving the casino an unfair competitive advantage, and they, I think, quite rightly felt that this was quite unfair. At the same time, those groups that are very concerned about the health and safety of people who work in these settings, who are exposed to secondhand smoke, and therefore open themselves up to a variety of illnesses and in some cases, extreme forms of illnesses leading to death, came forward and made very strong interventions at the Law Amendments Committee, asking for these provisions in the government's legislation to be rethought and removed so that we would go to a 100% smoke-free public places in the province. The government did not have the courage to do the right thing, either for the health and well-being of workers or for the competitive interests of the industry, and used their majority to push through a piece of legislation that had that significant flaw in it, even though one member of their own caucus was prepared to introduce an amendment to the bill to improve on it. But the government's bill did give municipalities the right to go further than what the government itself was prepared to do. And having provided that opportunity to municipal units, the HRM municipality and the CBRM municipality took the opportunity to do the right thing and to move in the direction of 100% smoke-free public places and to remove the unfair competitive advantage that this government was giving Casino Nova Scotia vis-a-vis other operators and owners in the hospitality industry. And lo and behold, Mr. Speaker, the second this was done, the Minister of Finance got a call from the Casino Nova Scotia operators and rushed to put into his Financial Measures Act this exemption for the casino. And, Mr. Speaker, ever since that has occurred, the Minister of Finance has been trying to soft pedal what in reality is an unacceptable and unfair piece of public policy. And he knows it, and members of the government benches know it, members of the government's backbenches know it, Nova Scotians know this. And we have recently seen a young woman, a very courageous young woman who worked at Casino Nova Scotia, leave her job for reasons of health and safety and apply for EI, be refused EI, have the casino operators intervene in her hearing in front of the administrative tribunal that that hears these cases and appeals. And yesterday, Mr. Speaker, Andrea Skinner's appeal was decided upon in a written decision. The Board of Referees for the EI process determined that, in fact, she was justified in leaving her job because her fear that she was being exposed to secondhand smoke and that it could be hazardous to her health. They determined it was a justified fear, and that, in fact, the evidence is there, Mr. Speaker, that exposure to secondhand smoke is hazardous to people's health. We have, Mr. Speaker, you will probably remember, I think you were in the chair the day that Heather Crow came to this legislature. Ms. Crow is a former Nova Scotian, a woman who has been living in Ontario for a number of years, currently lives in Ottawa, I believe, Mr. Speaker, and she has worked in the hospitality industry for most of her life. She has been working as a waitress, and she has never been a smoker, Mr. Speaker. But sadly, Heather Crow is terminally ill with lung cancer, and the medical expert opinion with respect to her lung cancer is that, in fact, her lung cancer was caused by exposure to secondhand smoke as a result of working in the hospitality industry. Mr. Speaker, when Heather came, she met with every caucus, every party caucus here in the legislature, the government caucus, the NDP caucus, and the Liberal caucus. And she said she wanted to be the last worker to die from secondhand smoke. And she really was pleading with us as people with the power to do something about other people in her industry who could end up, like herself, a relatively young woman with children, with loved ones, who are going to have to watch her die. And, Mr. Speaker, many of us, I think, have had friends and family members who have died from cancers, and particularly tobacco-causing cancers. And it is a very painful and difficult thing to go through, Mr. Speaker, and I know of which I speak. And I think that we have a responsibility, Mr. Speaker, to protect workers in this province. And it's really, it's more than disappointing what this government has done with respect to the casino and the workers. I listened to a clip on CBC radio this morning, the Premier talking about the Andrea Skinner decision yesterday, and I was horrified to hear our Premier, the most senior spokesperson for our province, say that it's a matter of choice, Mr. Speaker, that people working at the casino, it's a matter of choice whether or not they're going to be exposed to secondhand smoke. That's their choice. And I thought to myself, how many residents of my constituency, Halifax Needham, have I talked to in a 5-year period who worked at Casino Nova Scotia? I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, I know a fair number of people in my constituency who work at Casino Nova Scotia. And this isn't about individual choice. It's about going where the jobs are available to people. It's about having to put bread and butter on your family's table. And you know, I've just been reading a chapter in a book that's in our legislative library that examines Westray and what occurred in Westray. And you know, that was all about government talking about jobs, talking about people's choice to work in these environments. And I think we're seeing the same kind of cold, callous disregard for the health and welfare and well-being for Nova Scotian workers that was a part of that disgraceful example in the history of this province, and disgraceful because the political decisions from people who should have been acting responsibly were downright rotten, Mr. Speaker, and there's no other way to characterize what went on there. And Mr. Speaker, in this situation where this government is allowing workers to continue to be exposed to toxic and chemical substances that can lead to to illnesses and even death, this is not a matter that people should be taking lightly. And where our Premier is himself a medical doctor, I find it incomprehensible that this government can put in this Financial Measures Act such a provision. Now, Mr. Speaker, this is the health piece of this particular provision. But what about the implication, the ongoing implication that treating the casino as a special place in the hospitality industry has? What impact does that have on other small establishments in this province, and particularly in the HRM area, Mr. Speaker? I mean, I can look in my own constituency at Jenny's Place on Lady Hammond Road, or on Gus's Grill at the corner of Agricola and North Street. These are small, locally owned places, Mr. Speaker, whose proprietors work very hard to stay afloat quite often, Mr. Speaker. And they're up against this huge, powerful, influential operator and their own government, who seem to be more concerned about dancing to the tune of the casino operators than providing a level, competitive playing field for our own homegrown business community. And Mr. Speaker, that's not fair. And Nova Scotians recognize that that's not fair. The other thing, Mr. Speaker, I want to say is that, you know, the Minister of Finance one day in this House tried to pretend that the government of Nova Scotia are not the owners of Casino Nova Scotia. But in fact, Mr. Speaker, that's not the case. The Gaming Corporation is, in fact, through legislation, a corporation of this government, and this is whom the contract with the casino operators are. And Mr. Speaker, that's quite clear in legislation and in fact. So I would suggest that this government cannot duck their responsibility in this matter. They cannot duck this responsibility from the perspective of their ownership of Casino Nova Scotia. They cannot duck their responsibility with respect to the health and safety of workers in this province. They cannot duck their responsibility with respect to the fact that they empowered the municipalities in their Smoke-Free Act to go further the Premier stood in this House in closing the debate on the Smoke-Free Places Act last spring and said if the municipalities wanted to go further, well, fill your boots. He did. He said that. He stood there and he said that the municipalities were free to go further. And so the municipalities went further. And what does this government do? Tilt. We didn't really mean it. We're going to take back what we said. We're going to strip you from that legislative ability to go further, when they were prepared really to do what this government didn't have the courage to do. So, Mr. Speaker, I think that this is an amendment in the Financial Measures Act that is unsupportable. It's unsupportable. And we look forward to hearing, perhaps, from the members of the general public on what their ideas are about this amendment when we get to the law amendments process. Mr. Speaker, there are other provisions in this legislation, this bill, that are worth talking about and worth debating. And I'm sure we'll hear a fair amount about the tax cuts and the tax provisions, the so-called cut in taxes.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North would like to make an introduction. Is that agreeable? Yep. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Honourable Member for Halifax Needham for allowing the introduction. Mr. Speaker, again today in the East Gallery, there are representatives from the RRSS, councillors, and today, as like yesterday, Mr. Speaker, they will be rotating to watch the process of this Legislative Assembly. It is my hope that this Legislative Assembly will give them a warm round of applause.
Certainly welcome our guests to the gallery today and hope they enjoy the proceedings. The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, much has been made of the $155 bottle of rum that is contained in the Financial Measures Act. Mr. Speaker, I spend a fair amount of time thinking about this issue of tax breaks and tax cuts and paying taxes and income taxes and consumption taxes. I think that it is true, Mr. Speaker, that taxation in this country has taken a real toll on families, on individuals in the last few years. And I think if there's any tax that has been a regressive tax that has taken a huge toll on people in this country, it's the GST, or in Nova Scotia, the HST. Mr. Speaker, every time you buy a good or a service in this province, you pay tax, and that tax is the same rate of tax whether you're rich or you're poor, and that's what makes it a regressive tax, as you know, Mr. Speaker. The federal Liberal government once campaigned in a federal election, which they won, saying that they would do something about the GST. Of course, Mr. Speaker, they didn't do a darn thing about it. And Canadians continue and Nova Scotians continue to be burdened by this particular tax. In Nova Scotia, we have a variation of the GST, an agreement which has harmonized the provincial sales tax and the federal goods and service tax in a way that many things come under the HST, like taxes on children's clothing, like taxes on fuel, like taxes on electrical bills, like taxes on prescription drugs. Mr. Speaker, there are many other kinds of necessities of life that people are paying consumption taxes on. This government could have done something about that in a way that those with the least amount of incomes in our society would have seen a bigger bang for their buck. And they failed to do that. Mr. Speaker, you know, what they've done, first of all, with this $155 tax rebate is, in fact, they have made sure that they will reward people who have the least need in some ways for $155 than the people who need it the most. Mr. Speaker, I look at my community, my constituency, and I think about all of the people in my constituency who could use $155, who won't see a cent, Mr. Speaker. You know, single mothers who haven't been in the labor force with children because they have young children and they're caring for them, or they're in a community college program. If they've paid no income tax in the last few years, they will not see 1 cent of this $155, Mr. Speaker. And they could certainly use it. The National Council of Welfare just issued their annual report, I believe, for the year 2002, Mr. Speaker. And they show in that report that families in poverty in Nova Scotia are actually worse off under the income assistance program in Nova Scotia than they were before this government took office. And, Mr. Speaker, that reflects the finding of other researchers, and it reflects what we know just from our common sense, everyday understanding and experience. Anecdotally, we know that things have not improved for people who are the most poor in our community. There are a number of people in our province who have disabilities who would be on Canada Pension disability, Mr. Speaker, who will not see any of this money. I was thinking the other day of all of the people in this province I know who have six-figure salaries. You know, the president of Dalhousie University, who is my former boss, who has a six-figure salary, who lives in a house that's provided for by the university, whose children can go tuition-free to that university as long as he is the president of the university, is going to get $155 from this government. Yet, the person, the single mother on income assistance who wanted to go to that university has had that right taken away from her by this government, and she will not see 1 cent of the $155 in tax rebate. Mr. Speaker, this is the government that we have in the province of Nova Scotia. This is a government that values dollars over people and is incapable of behaving in a fair way, Mr. Speaker. They can't be fair when it comes to workers at the casino, and they're not fair in the way that they construct and deliver their tax breaks, Mr. Speaker. They had options, they had different choices, they could have done something differently, and they didn't, and they failed miserably in the way they've constructed this tax relief. And Mr. Speaker, you know, I know that people could use a break. They could use a better deal, but this is not a better deal. This is not a better plan at all. And Mr. Speaker, in addition to the $155, there is an additional change in income tax and a reduction in income tax. But again, this will advantage people at the top end of the income scale, and those at the bottom will be left, they will be left not much better off, Mr. Speaker. So I think that this Financial Measures Act has many flaws that are so deeply flawed that it's not really supportable if we are to truly represent all Nova Scotians. You know, if we really want to have the interests of all people represented in our province, we need to find ways in the financial measures of this province to address the things that really do need addressing for everyone. And this particular budget, in the way that it has allocated tax relief, leaves an awful lot of people out, Mr. Speaker. An awful lot of people will be left out. There are seniors who have been hit so hard by this government in terms of additional user fees and just this government's lack of action with respect to what the kinds of financial pressures that seniors are on, you know, trying to get automobile insurance, trying to pay for fuel in a very hard winter, Mr. Speaker, where we saw fuel costs going up. How does this government respond to those things? We see no action with respect to auto insurance, dragging their feet. We've had to push them and push them and push them, much like we've had to do in the long-term care situation, Mr. Speaker. We've had to come into this legislature every day and sort of embarrass them into taking some action, and still the action they take goes only so far, Mr. Speaker. In the long-term care, seniors in this province are going to have to wait until 2007, the year 2007, to have this government cover the health care costs for seniors. I mean, imagine, they're prepared to give away $68 million in $155 checks, many that will go to people for whom $155 is meaningless, but they are not prepared to pick up the $35 million long-term care costs for seniors in nursing homes. I mean, that is a scandal, Mr. Speaker. It's an absolute scandal. And I'm telling you, Mr. Speaker, I welcome an opportunity to go out and knock on doors in the constituency of Halifax-Needham and talk to people about what they think about this. It can't come too soon, Mr. Speaker, because the good people of Halifax-Needham are the most fair-minded and reasonable people I know. And I can tell you right now, Mr. Speaker, they're just sitting there, rubbing their hands, waiting for an opportunity to demonstrate what they think about the 4 years of this bumbling, stumbling, mean, unfair government. So, Mr. Speaker, with those few remarks, I will take my place and yield the floor to the member from Richmond.
The member for Richmond. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to commend the member from Halifax Needham for her comments on Bill number 36. Speaker, I did have the opportunity, as you know, to speak on the amendment previously on this. This is my first time to speak specifically on the actual Financial Measures Act. Now, Mr. Speaker, as you've heard from many of the previous speakers before me, quite a significant amount of concerns have been raised, not only about the whole budgetary process this government has undertaken, but certainly also in regards to the Financial Measures Act itself, which is the legislative power, giving the government the ability to put in place some of the changes that they've proposed in the budget. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take this opportunity to review some of the different items that we have learned as part of this session. And I have to tell you, as I've said before, it was my first session as the finance critic for Liberal Caucus, and what an experience it has been, and the information that we have been provided with. So let's go back. First, we have a minister who comes in and tells us that he's going to provide a 10% tax cut. And he claims that this is part of his Blue Book promise, or just living up to that. Then he tells us not only will it be a tax cut starting January 1st, 2004, he's also going to give us a tax check mailed out sometime in June for the amount of $155. So let's look at that particular item first. When you look at the budget of this year, we are told that that tax check, which many of our leaders certainly termed it as a tax loan and a rum bottle check, because the reason, and you ask, well, why is it a loan? Well, what do we have in this budget? We have a government that tells us we want to give money back to Nova Scotians, but at the same time, we want to borrow another $118 million. So, Speaker, $68 million is the total price tag for the check that's going to be sent out to Nova Scotians, and we're still borrowing another $118 million. One has to ask, what kind of logic is that? Mr. Speaker, when a government's going out and saying, I'm going to give you back money, but I'm going to have to go out and borrow in order to do so. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's where this government has hit a fundamental flaw. Now, our party has clearly said we support tax cuts. Tax cuts are a good thing, and they're something we should look forward to and that we should strive towards as a province and as a government. But to give a tax cut when you've got to go to the bank and borrow money, Mr. Speaker, that's just illogical is what it is. It just doesn't make sense. So then we start digging a little bit deeper, as I've said, and the question becomes, the Minister of Finance tells us, well, we want to put money in the pockets of Nova Scotians right away, $155, pay no attention to the fact we're borrowing the money, but it's going to stimulate the economy. Is it going to stimulate the economy? Well, we started asking, who came up with this idea? Did they have some sort of a financial report or economic forecast or a thesis paper or something that the Minister of Finance relied upon to say, if I send out $155, $68 million into the economy at once, it's going to grow the economy of Nova Scotia? When we asked, was there any of this? No. Who made the decision as to sending out this check? The Cabinet made the decision. So our wonderful Cabinet ministers, in all of their fiscal wisdom, who've added $500 million to the debt in 4 years, said, here's our solution. We're going to grow the economy by mailing out checks to Nova Scotians for $155. That's what we can rely upon for the sound financial advice that this government received on this decision. Now, at the same time, Mr. Speaker, here it is, the minister who's adding $118 million to the debt while handing out the checks, and says that he's a prudent fiscal manager. So, Mr. Speaker, he then goes on, Minister of Finance, and again, you know, if we're going to be injecting $68 million into the economy, the Minister of Finance has said what a wonderful thing it'll do for this province. Show us what facts that you've based this upon. Show us what reports, what studies that you have which show this is going to have the intended effect that you have said. Mr. Speaker, I don't think that's unreasonable to ask. $68 million of taxpayers' money. What sound fiscal advice was this based on? I would submit to you, Mr. Speaker, this was a political decision, not a fiscal decision. It was made by Cabinet, which is clearly a political body, not an independent body. And was it endorsed by any Chamber of Commerce or financial group or any other body that said, yes, we think it's a great idea? Not one. Not one, Mr. Chair. So what does that tell you when no one comes out and says, yes, we think this fiscally is a very wise decision. We think that you giving $68 million when you're borrowing 118 is a wonderful idea. And why has no one come forward to say that? An independent source? Because no one agrees. No one at all. No one at all has come out and said the Minister of Finance's plan is great and it's based on sound fiscal advice and sound fiscal planning. I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that is clearly not the case. This was a political decision. This was done at a time when the government knew it wanted to go to the polls, and it said, well, we can't get away with the rum bottle anymore. We can't get away with the ladies' stockings or with the chocolate. So we're going to send out the old rum bottle, $155 check in this case. Yet what's really sad is that, at least before, Nova Scotian could say, well, it's the Tory party that's paying for the bottles. In this case, it's Nova Scotian themselves that are paying for this. You got to ask yourself, the $155 you receive today, how much is that going to cost over time for the government to pay back? That $68 million that's being added to our debt. You know, Mr. Speaker, I have to tell you, it's almost outside the realm of reality when we're in here talking about these millions of dollars. When we were talking about the pension funds, we were talking about billions of dollars. Speaker, these are not sums to be taken very lightly. Yet the government doesn't appear to be concerned at all. And I can tell you, what are the people from Richmond County and what are the people from the rest of the province saying? They're saying, $68 million? How many roads would that pave? How many nurses would that hire? How many hospital beds would that open? How many teachers would it put in our classrooms? How many additional education programs would it provide to the Strait Regional School Board, who more and more has to rely on distance education rather than having teachers in the classroom teaching programs? That's what they're saying. So, Speaker, they're not saying, I can't wait to get my 155. But what's the other thing that we've learned, Speaker? And I can tell you, more and more when I get the notes, the messages coming back from my constituency assistant, who's doing a wonderful job, it's showing the names of people who have been calling to ask if they're going to get that check. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? Out of all the calls that have come to date, not one is going to receive that check. Yet, are these people who are undeserving? Have they not contributed to the economy? If you listen to the Minister of Finance, you would draw that conclusion. He basically says, if you don't pay income tax, you're a drain on the system and you don't contribute to the economy. That is basically the message. Yet, Mr. Speaker, for example, seniors on fixed incomes worked all their lives. They provided for us. They allow many of us to be where we're at today because of the work that they did. Are they a drain on the system? Are they not worthy of receiving some relief under this government's theory? Well, Speaker, they continue to pay the high cost of home heating fuel. If they're fortunate enough to have a vehicle, they pay the high cost of gas. They pay the high cost of insurance. This is the government that doubled their pharmacare premiums and their copay. And who benefits from this? Well, it's the Minister of Finance. The Minister of Finance. And it's under these type of schemes that in 1999, the total revenues for the province were forecasted at $4.6 billion. That's a lot of money. But today, 4 years later, because of such user fees, because of higher taxes under this administration, under this Minister of Finance, his forecast is now $5.6 billion, which is $1 billion more per year in revenue than what was there before this government came to power. So as I said before, we're talking about big numbers here. So in 4 years, you've got an additional $1 billion to play with. Did the Premier in 1999, when he gave his Blue Book, believe that he would have this much money to play with? I would submit to you he probably didn't, because he told us in 1999, the Blue Book, that, look, the $4.6 billion that is here now, I can live within my means. Healthcare doesn't need more money, it needs better management. And I can fix healthcare, he said. Then went on to say that healthcare, in fact, it needs a cut in administrative fat. Too much waste going on in the bureaucracy. Wow. So you don't need more money for health. He said he could live within his means. And on top of that, he gets an additional $1 billion a year in revenue. Well, under his plan, one would have to assume we should be having tremendous surpluses every year if John Hamm had been able to keep his word. Yet, Mr. Speaker, what does the record show? $1 billion more in hand and $500 million more in debt. That is what we have as a situation here. How could that happen? How could that happen? Because the Premier's plan in 1999 was based on $4.6 billion of revenue per year. And it said, page 1, Mr. Speaker, right there, I believe that my government will live within its means. And he went on to say, and I've repeated so many times, I almost know it by heart. It's too bad the Premier doesn't, but I appear to know more about his Blue Book than he does, other than what Mr. Batterson sends him in for some briefings periodically. Also goes on to say, I believe the practice of borrowing is nothing more than mortgaging the future of our grandchildren and children. Those are his words, Mr. Speaker. And that is what is so painful to this Premier, to hear his own words being thrown back at him and to be held accountable for his own statements. And what does he do? Does he stand here and say, well, maybe I was naive, thinking I could live within my means with all the promises I made. Maybe that was naive. So, look, I apologize, I meant it at the time, but obviously I wasn't able to do it. Has he said that? Not at all, Mr. Speaker. Not at all. Instead, the Premier continues to want to have us believe that, he's a man that Nova Scotians should look up to and the Tory party is so proud of. Yet, day in, day out, we put the words of the Premier back to him. His own quotes, his own statements, and he has to stand there and rather than just say, look, I was wrong or, it didn't work out the way I hoped. No, we don't get that. That would be irresponsible. So we're not going to get that. Instead, he's going to give us a political spin. That's why the other day, Mr. Speaker, we hear the pensions are $1.5 billion underfunded, unfunded liability. We find out the government has borrowed $500 million more into debt. We find out they want to put another $118 million on the debt this year. We then find out they want to borrow till 2013. And when asked, the Premier said, all is well. All is well. The finances are great. We've got everything under control. We've got a plan. All is well, and everything's perfect. Mr. Speaker, I couldn't help it at the time but say, my God, what a wonderful place, this imaginary land that our Premier lives in, where all is well and everything's fine. But, Mr. Speaker, the reality is, Nova Scotians realize that things are not well. Mr. Speaker, I would submit to you, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, there was little or no talk about the debt of this province. Why? Because the Minister of Finance was hoping, the House Leader, the whole crew over there were hoping, this debt, no one can see it. It's not like a building you can go visit and say, there's the debt of the province. Or they can't go and say, oh, look, I can see the debt is getting bigger because, look, it's increasing in size and I can touch the debt or it's going to burn my hands. That's not the case. So they're hoping, well, if we don't talk about it and they can't see it, they'll forget about it. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's like asking Nova Scotians to forget about their own mortgages, forget about their debt. Oh, many of us would probably wish we could forget about it, but that would be irresponsible. It would be irresponsible for us as individuals. And there are significant consequences to individuals who forget about their payments, who forget about what they owe, and who are not responsible with their finances. We all know what those are. Yet because this government is so large, and because it's a public institution, it can get away with being fiscally irresponsible. But only up to a certain point. Up to a certain point until the bond rating service starts to lower our rating. And you might ask, under the Premier's answers he's given his House, everything is so well, everything's going fine, then we must have a wonderful rating here in this province. We must have. So again, what have we been able to uncover in this session? Nova Scotia has the second worst credit rating of any province in this country. Now, I don't hear the Minister of Finance jumping to his feet or reading resolutions to say, what a wonderful thing this is. But again, what is their answer? Is their answer to say we are concerned about this bothers us? No. The answer is, it's okay, Dominion Bond. Again, those are people you can't see, they're away. Pay no attention to those guys. Mr. Speaker, we hear that from the Minister of Finance. Why? He grew up in an administration that had that same belief. Don't worry about the debt. Don't worry about spending too much. Well, at least what he's come out with now is say, okay, that the yearly deficit, that's a bad thing to show that on the books. So what can we do? Well, let's change the accounting principle so we don't have to show the deficit on the books. We'll just add it right to the debt. Mr. Speaker, everyone knows in this province that has watched the finances of this province, and I believe even the member from Halifax Fairview with the NDP caucus has said it several times himself. If the old accounting rules were in place that were used in 98 and 97, this government's budget would have a significant deficit. That is the reality. They have changed the accounting rules to suit their purposes. And what they have hoped is through their spin doctors is that let's just convince Nova Scotians if you balance the budget, everything's fine. Everything's fine. Nothing else, everything's bad. And for those who would criticize us for borrowing money and adding to the debt, that's when you start getting the Minister of Finance and yesterday the Minister of Education, one of the most ridiculous statements I've heard yet in this House, say that our leader would not build new schools under his plan. Well, Mr. Speaker, I have to tell you that was a pure sign of desperation, but coming from a member who won by 16 votes, I would expect nothing less than to make the statement, if you're not adding to the debt, you're not building schools. Now, what kind of logic is that, Mr. Speaker? What kind of a statement is that? Is that something that's supposed to be, truthful and accurate to give to the people of Nova Scotians as a statement? Not at all. Not at all. The purpose of that was not to provide accurate information. It was nothing more than propaganda. To say, if the Liberals don't add to the debt, they won't build schools, they won't build hospitals, they won't pave roads. Well, what kind of respect does this government have for the intelligence of Nova Scotians when they come out with statements like that? Well, Mr. Speaker, I can tell you that Nova Scotians are clearly saying we've given this government an opportunity. We've given them 4 years to be able to live up to the promises they've made. 1999, John Ham said he could do all of this with $4.6 billion, which was the annual revenue that we were getting at the time. So now Nova Scotians are saying, well, we gave him 4 years. He said he could do it at $4.6 billion. To make it even better, he now has an additional $1 billion a year. So he must be able to live up to those commitments. And what has happened at the end of the day? The Minister of Finance stands up, his colleagues applaud him, and what does he do? He adds another $118 million to the debt. Now, Mr. Speaker, comes up another issue. Will it only be $118 million added to the debt? I would submit to you that with some of the other fact-finding that we've been able to uncover, that number may increase sooner than later, Mr. Speaker. What we have asked for, I wrote to the Minister of Finance, and I asked, you tell us what the state of our pensions are. We've seen where Dalhousie University has suffered major losses. We've seen where the province of New Brunswick, city of St. John, have suffered significant major losses in the millions of dollars. We've seen Quebec's plan, Ontario's plan, public service plans. I think one of them in Quebec lost over $1 billion. So, naturally, being responsible members, we said, well, will the Minister of Finance indicate to us where are we at? We know the markets haven't been very good. We know that we're probably haven't been sheltered from some of the market downfall there's been. So just show us, tell us where we're at. Give us an idea. Put Nova Scotians' minds at rest. Let them know that things are okay. Now, Mr. Speaker, we've asked that in February. The Minister of Finance said, I'll have it to you by the end of March. At the end of March, I stood in this house and I asked, well, where are they? Oh, he said, I'll have them for you mid-April. Okay, mid-April. Mid-April, I said, well, where are they now? He said, the end of April. Well, Mr. Speaker, if I'm not mistaken, today's May 1st. Still no report. When the Deputy Minister came here before Public Accounts, he said, well, it now looks like it'll be June before we can give this information. Well, There's different conclusions one can draw from that, Speaker. One can draw the conclusion that, yeah, maybe yes, it's legitimate, it is taking them this long. Nothing to be concerned about. Don't worry. The other conclusion is the minister intentionally holding back this information for fear of what reactions there will be amongst Nova Scotians if they are to see the true numbers? Well, one could say, oh, that's just, grandstanding, posturing. Well, is it? During public accounts, the Deputy Minister told us that he had a report. His last report on the state of the pensions was November 30th of the year 2002. At that point, November 30th, 2002, our pension plans administered by the Minister of Finance, in which our teachers rely upon when their retirement, our public civil servants rely upon for their retirement, as of November 30th, 2002, they were underfunded by $1.5 billion. Now, Mr. Speaker, that's a lot of money. Nova Scotians, technically, no matter how the Minister of Finance wants to try to spin it and put a rosy picture on it, are on the hook today for at least $1.5 billion. But then ask yourself, that was in November of 2002. Where are we at today? Has it gotten better? Or has it gotten worse? Well, I think that's a legitimate question to ask. This is a lot of money. You have thousands of people who rely upon this. Not only that, at the end of the day, this is every single Nova Scotian's money that are in these funds. They have a right to know that this is being properly invested, that this is being properly maintained. And yet, rather than wanting to come to this house and say, look, I want to put everyone's mind at ease. Here is the most latest information I have on the state of pension funds, and here's why I tell you, you should not be concerned. Well, he tells us, I need the actuarial report. Does he? Deputy Minister told us at public accounts that they receive, I believe the statement was, quarterly updates on the health of the pension plans. Well, now, Speaker, as I said, I do come from a legal background, not a financial background. But if the last report was in November of 2002 and they receive quarterly reports, in my own math, that would tell me that by May 1st, we should have gotten another report. Somewhere's in there. One, if not two. Yet, does the minister stand in his place and say, look, Member from Richmond has raised a significant issue, something I take seriously. I want to put Nova Scotians' mind at rest. That, we don't have to worry, things are going well here, that, here's the reasons why I've chosen not to put money into the plans to help stabilize them like so many other jurisdictions have. Here is the financial advice I'm relying upon on the decision made by the government just to ride out the market, hoping things get better. He doesn't come with anything. So what conclusion are you left to draw but to say that there's something they want to hide? And guess what's coming up, Mr. Speaker? Well, we know there's an election on the horizon. If this information were to be made available, I would submit to you that the information we got at public accounts was damaging enough to this government. I would submit to you that the numbers are not better. The numbers are probably worse. And that's why the government's in no rush to give us those numbers. And I will submit to you right now, and I'll make the prediction, that Nova Scotians will not see those numbers as the state of the pension plans until after the next election. I guarantee you that they will not. Because if it comes out, we will see that this province, the health of our pension plans, is not where we would like them to be, and it will cast doubt as to the Minister of Finance's budget. That is why this information will not be shared. Again, Mr. Speaker, the Minister has been given ample opportunity to address this issue, and he has chosen not to. Speaker, we talk about two of the plans, the Public Service Superannuation Plan, the Teachers' Pension Plan. There are other plans. There is, I believe, the Retiring Justices Pension Plan. There is a Deputy Minister's Pension Plan. There's the Remembrance Allowance Pension Plan. And I believe there's at least one more, a few of those plans. Now, Speaker, as I said before, I don't come from a financial background, so a lot of this stuff is new information to me and adjusting to it. But listening to the Deputy Minister tell us, for example, I believe it was the Deputy Minister's Retiring Pension Plan. That plan requires $397 million in order to meet the needs required today if everyone who qualifies for that were to draw. So that's $397 million. And we ask, okay, that's what you need. What is the value of the pensions today for that fund? What was the answer? Zero. No value. And for some of the other pensions, it was close to being no value. Now, Mr. Chair, I don't want to stand here and raise alarm, but I can tell you that that doesn't seem to be a good situation to me. That you need $397 million and the value of that particular plan is zero. Something's wrong. So that is just but one issue that we've been able to uncover here, and that continues to be a mystery to Nova Scotians because the government refuses to provide us with the information that they have. And we know they have that information now just by what we've been able to uncover. Now, Mr. Speaker, I've said it before and I'm going to say it again. When this government came forward with the check plan, they didn't say this is a decision that was made by cabinet. They just, when they were asked the questions about, well, why didn't you just put in a tax cut for July 1st of this year? Well, the messages that were coming, well, can you even change the tax midway through the year? Then you were starting to hear them talking about, well, how much time would you have to give the feds? And the Minister of Finance says, no, we've never said that. I've never even given that indication. Yet, when our leader said that he would not support a tax cut on January 1st, 2004, and would in fact reverse that and leave it as it is, right away the Minister of Finance was the first one off the bat to say, oh, no, he needs to give Revenue Canada all of this notice, and he'll never have time to do that. And Danny Graham should go do his homework because we know that you need to give this much time. And they seem to know a lot about the rules with Revenue Canada all of a sudden. So that's why when we checked with Revenue Canada and said, well, hold on now, this government's saying that they had to send out a check because you guys couldn't change the rate. I said, that's not true. We could change the rate July 1st, 2003. And how much notice did we need? We would have preferred to get notice by April 15th. But if it was a little later, we could have worked with that. So then, Mr. Speaker, keep in mind, so that's April 15th for July 1st change, and there was flexibility with the April 15th date. I believe the budget was tabled April 3rd. So at that point, all of a sudden they started changing the message. No, stop talking about Revenue Canada and that. No, the Liberals are on to us. We need to change the message again. All of a sudden, that's when the Minister of Finance started saying, well, no, we made the decision to send the check. So then when we kept asking, well, who's we? Is it the Department of Finance, senior officials who have tremendous experience here in the finance of the province? Are they the ones who suggested this? Not at all. It was Cabinet. The most political body we have here in this province is the one who made this decision. Was it based on sound financial advice, on studies or anything? Not at all. It was pure politics, Mr. Speaker. So that's at that point the Minister of Finance stopped talking about Revenue Canada completely. And we found out when he was saying that Danny Graham cannot reverse the change, that in fact there was lots of opportunity to reverse that change before January 1st, 2004. So then what's the spin? Oh, well, if he reverses the change before January 1st, the change hasn't taken effect. Oh, well, he's going to be raising taxes. Wow, Mr. Speaker, again, who does he think he's fooling? Do you think any Nova Scotian is going to buy that? The effect doesn't kick in before January 1st, 2004, and anyone who keeps the system as it is now is raising taxes. This coming from the same minister who failed to decouple the federal tax bracket when the feds lowered their taxes. In front of the media, he had to admit, yes, but by doing so, I raised taxes. Under his own logic, he raised taxes. So for a government that said they would not raise taxes, first, we know they did by adding 2 cents to gas. That brought them $25 million in 1 year. Still amazes me. And now the Minister of Finance had to admit, well, I also, by continuing bracket creep, I'm going to, I in fact did raise taxes, yes. Now, Mr. Speaker, now they're coming back and saying, well, the Liberals wanted us to put an end to bracket creep and, their message is mixed. Not at all. When the issue of bracket creep came up, the Minister of Finance was telling us we're living within our means. The finances are great. I don't need to borrow. I'm doing exactly as I said. So we said, well, if that's the case, if we are to believe you, then why don't you end bracket creep and decouple the taxes? Well, Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, we were basing that ourselves on false assumptions because we actually believed the Minister of Finance when he told us that our finances were healthy. We were duped by him into believing everything was well. Now he comes back and says, the Liberals wanted me to do this and I was borrowing money and, what their message is mixed. No, it's not. We made the mistake of believing the Minister of Finance, of believing him of what our financial health was, where we now know it wasn't what he claimed it to be. Now he uses it as an argument to say that we're sending mixed messages. Not at all, Mr. Speaker. The only problem, the thing we did, the naivety I have to say that we had, was in believing the Minister of Finance. And for that, we've certainly learned from that. It won't happen again, I can assure you. We actually believed him. We thought, hey, maybe this guy has learned from the error of his ways. Maybe we should believe him. And now he turns around and says that the Liberals are sending mixed messages coming from that government. And I can go into so many issues. Sunday shopping. How many messages have we gotten on that? First, the Premier only buys his paper on Sunday. Then he says he's not going to talk about it. Then he says he went around the province, he listened to everyone, and the Minister of Justice at the time stood up and said, we're not talking about it for 2005, don't bother me anymore. Then they come out, the Minister of Energy comes out and says, no, we're going to talk about it again. All of a sudden the Premier says, well, I'm going to go on my barbecue tour again and I'll listen. Then he comes back and says, no Sunday shopping, that's it. And now all of a sudden, after our leader, Danny Graham, made it clear that our party would support Sunday shopping with certain restrictions as to the time and the impact on workers and that, the Premier all of a sudden says now that he wants to talk about it. Speaker, we get the Minister of Health, comes rushing in here, tells us, don't go to Toronto. And by the end of the day, 12 hours hadn't passed. 24 hours hadn't passed. She's then back in the news saying, no, go to Toronto. Pay no attention to what I said. And yet, on the debt, same thing. I can list so many more examples, and this government says that the Liberal caucus is sending mixed messages. Well, my. It takes quite a bit to keep track of where this government is going, as they change by the day to try to suit their political needs. So, Mr. Speaker, what else have we found out? Well, we knew all along that the costs each year of servicing the debt of this province were quite high. We had statements from the Premier, I believe in 2001, where he said, look, it's too high. We need to get control of this. We're spending more on debt servicing than we will soon be spending on education, because the debt servicing doesn't put more teachers in the classroom, doesn't build more schools, doesn't buy more books, doesn't buy more supplies. We need to get control of this. That was a couple of years ago. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the debt servicing at that time, I don't have the numbers right here, but I believe at the time when he made the statement, the debt servicing would have been in the range of the upper $700 million a year. So it was just a little bit under what we spend on education. So the Premier says he's got great control over debt servicing. He realizes how important that this is, and he's going to get control of it. Under this year's budget, Mr. Speaker, here is the control the Premier has gotten on debt servicing. The estimate for 2002-2003 on the debt servicing charge. Now, just before I go any further, again, debt servicing charge. Where does this go? Does it go to help homeless people? Does it go to help students? Does it go to help seniors? Does it go to help the poor? No, it goes to banks. It goes away. It goes out of the province. We see no benefit from this. This is Nova Scotians' hard-earned tax dollars that they pay to this government through user fees, through taxes on goods. It's gone out of the province. So how much? Well, in 2002, the Premier said this is very serious. It was in the range of $700 million at the time. So here's what their plan is. Here's how they've gotten grasp of this. The estimate for 2002-2003, $890.3 million. Goes out to the province, goes to banks. And then the estimate for 2003-2004, $892 million is what the estimate is. Then they go on to say, so that hasn't increased too much, so one would think, whoa, maybe we've gotten a bit of control under this. Well, hold on, Mr. Speaker. It says that the estimate for 2004-2005 is going to be $977.2 million per year under this Tory plan. And then, does it stop there? No. The estimate for 2005-2006, $1.020 billion. $1 billion of our money is leaving this province under this Tory government. That is their vision. That is their plan. $1 billion is going out. Does it stop there? No. 2006, 2007, it is anticipated at $0.046.1 billion. It's not going down, it's going up. How can that be? The minister says now we're under gap, everything is fine. The premier says all is well. Then how is this going up? Every single year under their plan, $1 billion within a few years is what's leaving this province. Now imagine what you could do with $1 billion. What could you do? You could pave every road there is in Richmond County. You'd probably pave it with gold, and you still have money left. How many nurses could we hire? How many more hospitals could we have? Or better hospitals, enhanced hospitals, better equipment, more physicians wanting to come to this province because of the excellent health care that we have. Fewer waiting lines. $1 billion, Mr. Speaker. So under this government's plan, they are taking in revenues, which is the taxes that all of us pay, and the user fees and the increases on all the goods that we pay. They have a budget forecasted this year of $5.6 billion. And what we now know is within a couple of years, $1 billion plus of that will be going away to banks outside this province. Is that acceptable, Mr. Speaker? That's not only is it not acceptable, that is the fundamental failure of this government and of this premier. Because this is a premier who said on page 1, my government will live within its means. Mr. Speaker, not only have they not lived within their means, they haven't come a country mile close to living within their means. Yet they'd like us all to believe the budget is balanced, all is well. Now, Mr. Speaker, what the Dominion Bond Rating Service has said about our budget, they have called it an adjusted deficit. Because they said at the end of the day, this budget is at a deficit, but they've adjusted it under GAAP to make it look like it's balanced. These are the people who rate the credit of this province. If we were to believe the Minister of Finance that his balanced budget and his efforts are being successful, then we would not be rated the second worst province in the country. Mr. Speaker, and I have to tell you, now that I'm looking at, we hear the sounds, the sounds of spring in the legislature under the Tory government are amongst us today. Protesters are outside. Are they protesting about something frivolous or just an issue that they thought up of? No, Mr. Speaker. These are workers who work with some of the most special people that we have here in this province that are out here on the picket line because this government won't sit down and negotiate in good faith and put some real money on the table. Yet, Mr. Speaker, they're to be told there is no money. We cannot put any more money on the table. Yet, from 1999 till today, $1 billion in additional revenue. Who has that come from? Well, I bet you these workers have contributed to that. They've paid their tax. They've paid the HST on gas. They've paid the HST on home heating oil. They've paid the skyrocketing insurance rates. Yet, what are they told by this government? It's no money. No money for you. Go back to work. We're not budging. I met yesterday with one of the workers of the Regional Residential Service, who's a native of Richmond County. We went to university together. She couldn't believe, and she said, how far will this government take us? And I said, I'd love to tell you that this government, recognizes the importance of the service you're providing, and that it's bothering the Minister of Finance, and it's bothering the Minister of Community Services, and it's tearing apart at the Premier that you guys are out on strike and the impact this is having on the clients. Speaker, I had to tell her I'd be lying to you if I said that. I wouldn't be giving you a true assessment because, unfortunately, their record speaks for itself. This is a government that brought our paramedics to the strike line. This is a government that brought our nurses to the strike line. And now there's a government which brought these workers who work, again, with some of the most special people in our society, they've brought you to the strike line. And Mr. Speaker, I got to tell you, even with an election looming, the gall of this government appears that they're more than happy to go to an election without taking care of the situation, with allowing the situation to deteriorate. And I say shame on them for that fact, Mr. Speaker. First paramedics, then nurses, now residential workers. My God, who's next? That's what you got to ask, Mr. Speaker. What Nova Scotians should be asking. Can they sink any lower? Is there a more cherished group that we as Nova Scotians have that this government hasn't picked on, or that this government hasn't brought to a strike? They're running out of options, I have to tell you. But they're working their way down the list, one at a time. And shame on them for that. And the Financial Measures Act, you know, they've got the residential workers on strike now, what is it, 3 weeks, almost a month? And it's not going anywhere. Yeah, Mr. Speaker, one phone call from the casino, and we got a bill in front of the house. Here, we got to take care of this right away. They wait out a month. They've been on strike for a month or more. And no, we don't, we can't take care of this problem. Yet the casino comes calling, and right away the next day we have a bill in front of the house. Now, Mr. Speaker, that is how Nova Scotians would judge the priorities of this Premier and the priorities of this government. When you've got residential workers asking for fairness, they don't have time for them. The casino makes one phone call and they're tripping over themselves to try to accommodate every request. That speaks for itself, Mr. Speaker. And again, it's another example of how in this session that we have worked to try to let Nova Scotians see the quality of the Premier that they have. And how have we done that? Is it by hurling insults at him, by making statements which aren't correct? Not at all, Mr. Speaker. What has the Liberal caucus done? We've gone back through Hansard, we've gone back through the media, we've looked for quotes of the statements made by the Premier, and we say, let us judge the Premier's statements by his actions. And what have we done? We have stood in this House, I have done so repeatedly, and said, Mr. Premier, on this day, here's what you've said. How do you explain that, what you said, and what your actions are? And I got to tell you, Mr. Speaker, there is no doubt in my mind why we now have over 80 questions that have been asked of this Premier which he has refused to answer. Why? There's nothing worse than having your own words thrown right back at you. And that your actions go completely against the words that you told Nova Scotians. That's why the Premier doesn't want to answer. That's why Sir Batterson and others are telling him, no, deflect it off to the Minister of Finance. He's not running again. Let him answer it. Let him holler at them and let him avoid the question. But, save yourself and protect yourself. Mr. Speaker, we even have, I believe here, it's somewhere in my desk here, we have the advice to Premier from Mr. Batterson where he even admits that the Premier's comments on the debt are problematic. The commitments that he made, he is saying the Liberal caucus has got you. They've clearly exposed that your statements and your commitments have not been fulfilled. They've not been kept. And here's what you should say to try to deflect that. Does it say in the briefing notes, yes, I was mistaken in saying that I could live within my means and that the debt would not grow? No, it doesn't say that. It says talk about this and talk about our plan and talk about all that. It fails to address the fundamental fact. Our Premier, on the first page of Blue Book, made a fundamental commitment to the people of Nova Scotia, and he broke it. But then again, this is the same Premier who says we did nothing wrong in the paramedic strike. Same Premier who said Bill 68 wasn't a bad thing. We did nothing wrong to the nurses. The same Premier who said we are treating the residential society workers with great respect, and we're showing them the utmost of respect, and we're doing a fine job in our negotiations with them. Speaker, as I've said many times, the mask is coming off and the veil has been lifted. And Nova Scotians will not be fooled by this Premier anymore, because they are now seeing the true face of the Premier. And I got to tell you, Mr. Speaker, what many people in Richmond County tell me, it's not a pretty sight in many cases. And I would tell you, Mr. Speaker, there is more to come. Because whether we go into an election sooner or later, we will continue to let Nova Scotians see exactly what the Premier said and what he has done. And yet, you know, in true Tory fashion, when your back's against the wall, when someone's clearly showing that you failed to keep your commitments, do you admit that you've done wrong? Do you address it head on? No. We've got a Premier that keeps referring back to 1993, 10 years ago. 10 years ago, a Premier who's enjoyed a majority government for 4 years. An unprecedented growth in the economy during those 4 years. And yet he wants to compare that to 1993? Nobody's buying it, Mr. Speaker. You can't compare. He's got $1 billion more in revenue, an unprecedented economic growth, and yet he says that he should be able to compare his government of today with the government of 1993. Mr. Speaker, that's clearly unacceptable. But I got to tell you one thing, and you know, we know in this bill, as I said, how quickly they've come to trip over themselves to accommodate the casino, although there's been no sign of that the casino plans on acting on this. They're changing their spin on this by the day. But I want to tell you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to give you a bit of a history lesson, because many of the members here weren't here under minority government of 1998 to 1999. But when I hear the Minister of Justice and I hear the Minister of Finance get up and say, why didn't the member from Dartmouth East introduce smoking legislation during the minority government? Mr. Speaker, let me bring you back just for a few seconds. And I'm sure the Minister of Justice will be quite familiar, because the Minister of Justice was about the only fella in the Tory caucus, which I think had 10 members at the time. There was a coup d'etat taking place in the Tory caucus, a very public coup d'etat. You had the member from Colchester-Musquodoboit Valley calling the press, talking like Elmer Fudd, saying that was it, they were going to get rid of their leader. All of the other members were lining up like soldiers, getting ready to get rid of their leader. Who was their leader? It was Mr. John Ham, now the Premier. Who was the one lone soldier who said, I'm going to stand by my man? None other than the Minister of Justice, who right away one could see when the coup was over and the Premiers was saved, the Minister of Justice was planked right next to the leader of the third party at the time. Yet I can tell you, he had a sore neck, Mr. Speaker. He had a very sore neck, because most of his time had to be spent turning around to watch the Premier's back for the ones who were sitting behind the Premier, to see if the knives were still out. And yet they have the gall to stand here and say, why didn't the mayor from Dartmouth East bring smoking legislation? We would have supported it. They couldn't even support their own leader. And yet they wanted us to trust them. They were all lined up, ready to put an end to the political life of their own leader. And now they have the gall to stand here and say, you guys should have passed smoking legislation. Now, Speaker, if I have misspoken, if I have some way not given an accurate portrayal of the facts, let them stand and say it's not true. Yet they don't, because they realize it is true. They realize those that were there, and I would submit to you, other than the Minister of Justice, I would find all of them guilty of the efforts of sustaining a coup d'etat against their own leader in minority government. Imagine now, Mr. Speaker, when you're to the point where you have an elected member of the legislature calling the media and talking like Elmer Fudd, and then they're telling us you should have trusted this gang and you should have passed legislation when you were in minority government. Well now, Speaker, Nova Scotians will judge those statements for itself. That again, what is it? It's a sign of desperation. It's a sign of desperation for a government that realized that their own smoking legislation is being trumped by every municipal unit around this province. Most of them have already taken that action. And the Minister of Tourism doesn't need to be reminded of that. He knows that in the Strait area, every jurisdiction has gone further than his government has. Every jurisdiction. Yet he stands as the Minister of the Office of Health Promotion and says, what great legislation we've passed. Wow, Mr. Speaker, if it is so good, why is every municipal unit going further than the government has? Because it's a fundamental flaw. And rather than admit, look, we've done wrong with our bill, they now resort to saying the Liberals should have brought it in under minority government. Mr. Speaker, nobody's buying that. Nobody's buying that at all. They realize this government had an opportunity. They had the support of our caucus fully. I believe they had the support, for the most part, from the NDP. They could have brought in stronger legislation. yet they caved in once again. Overall, Mr. Speaker, if you look at the theme of my discussion in the last hour, what does it bring all together? The theme is the same for whatever subject it is when it comes to this government, and that theme is missed opportunities. Whether it be in the finances, whether it be in smoking, whether it be in Sunday shopping, whether it be in treating the workers of the Residential Services Society appropriately, whether it be putting Nova Scotians' priorities number one, missed opportunities. And yet I go to you again, Mr. Speaker, and say, if this government could stand and say, look, the economy was bad and things weren't good and we just couldn't live up to the expectations that we had created. That's not the case, Speaker. We know they've seen unprecedented growth. We know they've achieved an additional $1 billion yearly in revenue on the backs of Nova Scotians. They've pretty much doubled every user fee there is. Mr. Speaker, as someone has coined the phrase, the Tories have got you from conception to death. Because they got you from the birth certificate to the death certificate and everything in between. They have increased the fees on all of that. Yet, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians have said time and time again, if you're putting what you call a user fee and you're saying this is a fee that users are being charged in order to provide the service, I think most reasonable Nova Scotians will say, if you can show me that the cost of giving me my birth certificate is justified, that it justifies charging me $20 to $25 for that birth certificate, well, then maybe it is an appropriate cost. Yet when this government has been asked to table in this House, when they've increased their user fees, show us on what basis this increase is being made and what the cost of the service is to the delivery of the product. Have they done that? No, they haven't done that. When they increase fees and we ask, well, show us where the cost is, show us why the $5 increase or the $20 increase is justifiable, they won't provide the numbers. Now, what does that lead you to conclude? That the increase is not to reflect the cost of providing the service. The increase is to reflect the desire of the Minister of Finance to take more money out of the pockets of Nova Scotians for the budget. I'll give you a modern day example, something we've talked about quite an extent here in this House. The additional charges, the hikes, the unprecedented hikes made to the Freedom of Information system. We've continually asked, show us the cost of administrating the program and then tell us how you achieve the new fee that you're charging. That's not unreasonable, Mr. Speaker. That's what we as responsible legislators should be asking and should be seeing from a government that takes in $5.6 billion a year in revenue. Yet they won't provide us with that. The Minister of Justice then wouldn't do it. The Minister of Justice now wouldn't do it. Why? Because the fee increase was in no way to reflect the cost of administrating the system. The fee increase was meant to discourage Nova Scotians from applying for information from this government. And when you'd ask, well, why is that? Because time and time again between our caucus and the NDP caucus, this government has been continually ridiculed and embarrassed because of the information they've hidden from Nova Scotians, rather than coming out and sharing it. So that was their response. We got to put an end to this. We got to stop the Liberals and the NDP from getting all this information, and the average Nova Scotian too. They're coming out and finding all sorts of stuff we don't want to get out there. That was the reason for that, Mr. Speaker. A tax cut at a time when you're borrowing, Mr. Speaker, just doesn't make sense. One person has likened it to going and paying your mortgage with your Visa. Yes, you made your mortgage payment, but at the end of the day, you're still going to get a bill from Visa for the money you owe. That is what the check that's being sent out is. That is what the 10% tax cut is. It is a loan, because the day that is going to need to be cashed in and it's going to need to be paid is soon coming. The Dominion Bond Rating Service and all the creditors are only going to let this government go so far until they say, enough. You've got one of the highest debts per population, if not the highest in the country. It is going to come to the point where they're going to say, that's it, enough. We're going to cut the credit card. Mr. Speaker, that is exactly what our caucus and our leader is saying, that Nova Scotians need to cut the credit card and get control again of our finances, because clearly this administration has failed to do so. And we cannot continue to pay mortgages with visas. We can't continue to be sending out money while at a time when we are borrowing. And Mr. Speaker, they say they're good financial managers. And I have asked in this House, we've seen over $700 million in commitments being made by this government. Whether it be Stora, whether it be the new Civic Centre in Port Hawkesbury, whether it be the new jail in Yarmouth, the new courthouse in Hawkesbury, the new courthouse in Lunenburg County, all of these projects and many more. They're all worthy projects, Mr. Speaker. Where is the money? Where's the money for it? Show us in the budget where the money is for it. And the answer is, Speaker, the money's not there. These are promises being made beyond the mandate of this government. Somebody else will be responsible for trying to keep the funding commitments made, because the money is just not there. And when I asked that, Mr. Speaker, the finance critic, show us where the money is. Well, again, you want to talk about the ridiculous? We don't hear him talk often. We certainly hear him barking often enough. But the member from Yarmouth gets up and says, by asking where the money is, that means the member's against the new jail in Yarmouth. Well, Mr. Speaker, how more ridiculous can you get than for a member, an intelligent member, to make such a statement? Mr. Speaker, as finance critic, it is responsible to ask, where is the funding for this? The people of Yarmouth, the people of Port Hawkesbury, the people throughout this province that have been promised these projects have a right to know and be comfortable in knowing that the money is there, that this is not just an election promise, that here they can point out clearly where the money is, and that there's no fears they will not get this money. They have a right to know that. Yet this government cannot give them that commitment because the commitments being made are well beyond their mandate. I'll give you another example, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Education, on the eve of an election, will come out and announce a new school capital construction program. He will go to communities and he will promise them new schools with great fanfare and great hoopla. And you have to ask yourself, how much money is in this budget to pay for these schools? Speaker, I believe the answer was there's some planning money. Is there money for bricks and mortar and drywall and paint? No, there's none. In fact, the new schools that this government will promise, they won't even start to even be looked at till 2005, which is clearly beyond the legal mandate of this government. So that's what Nova Scotians need to realize. And again, I go to you, Mr. Speaker, page 1 of the Blue Book, where the Premier says the last election the Liberals cynically tried to buy your votes with $200 million in commitments. I will respect voters. I will live within my means. Now, Mr. Speaker, I got to tell you, $700 million plus is what this government has now committed to. And there's no end. Expect more. Expect more. They will almost soon reach the level of commitments that they're making on borrowed money, because it's not there in the budget. They'll almost reach the $1 billion mark, which is a good reminder of the fact that under this administration, they will soon be paying $1 billion of our hard-earned money that'll be sent outside this province. And that is, again, one of the fundamental failures of this government. They've added $500 million to the debt. Now they want to send $1 billion of our money out to the banks year in, year out. That is just not acceptable. That is not what John Hamm told us he would give us in 1999. They have unprecedented growth. There is no reason that this incompetence has taken place, this fiscal mismanagement. Nova Scotians clearly will pass judgment on this government and are clearly saying enough is enough. You were given your chance. You have failed to do so. Sending us out $155 will not buy our votes. We will not accept such irresponsibility for our finances, and it's time to give room for another administration to come in. And Mr. Speaker, I look forward to working with Danny Graham, our leader, and with all of my colleagues in giving Nova Scotians that option and preparing for the opportunity to take over the next administration here in this province. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Order, please. The member for Halifax Atlantic.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I am pleased to have an opportunity to rise and speak again on Bill number 36. I spoke earlier this week on this bill, Mr. Speaker, as it pertained to a motion that had been put on the floor to hoist the bill for 6 months, and at that time I spoke about the bill in relation to what it was trying to, or the budget and this government's fiscal strategy, and what they were trying to achieve with this budget, and what the implications were of the fanfare around a quote-unquote balanced budget. I talked at that time, Mr. Speaker, about the lack of investment in so many other areas, the serious deficit in capital construction in the education system, the 20 or more millions of dollars necessary to bring special education support in the education system up to scratch, the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars needed to be invested in our roads, bridges in the province of Nova Scotia to bring them up to a standard where they're not jeopardizing lives and property. And I talked about that. It was perhaps an argument that had a little more of a longer view to it, but I think the problem that we've gotten into, Mr. Speaker, in this country over the, probably not just this country, but over the past decade or so, is that we set these budgets from to go in 3 or 4 year stints, basically just over the term of an election or over an election cycle. And what they failed to do is all they're trying to achieve from one budget to the next, from one annual budget to the next, is to get the government of the day through that particular period of time, and so that they can say, look at what we have done. In this case, the government has said that we are in a surplus situation on the books as it relates to accounting practices, that we are not running a deficit, and that's been the goal. But you know, when you think about it, and that's what I was trying to argue earlier this week, when you think about the real problems that we have in our province, in our community, which requires investment of tax dollars and of energy, this goal of having a surplus on paper is a pretty mediocre goal at best, Mr. Speaker, and serves no one's interests other than the perceived political interests of this government. So anyway, I canvassed that area and that theme in my last intervention. This time, what I was thinking about was, because Bill 36, the Financial Measures Act, is put here before us, and it is the legislation which enacts and supports and enacts the budget that we voted on earlier. And in thinking about this Financial Measures Act, if you're voting for it or against it, you're voting for or against the budget. And so I thought about this Financial Measures Act in relation to what does this budget do for some of the challenges that are facing the people of my constituency in Halifax Atlantic. Does this budget, through the Financial Measures Act, deal at all with some of the significant challenges facing the people of Halifax Atlantic? So I want to take some time this morning, if I may, Mr. Speaker, to cover some of that territory. I think the logical place to start would be with the $155 tax rebate that is being provided to 430-odd thousand Nova Scotians. Some have referred to it as a rum bottle on paper. Others have called it other much more disparaging things. But nonetheless, 433,000 Nova Scotians are going to get a check for $155. And frankly, $155 is nothing to be sneezed at. People have talked about it in relation to what they can buy, a couple of pizzas, a few cases of beer, maybe some flowers, maybe a new shrub for the garden, maybe a toy for your child. But $155 is $155 and shouldn't be sneezed at. But people are responding to the $155 as a cynical ploy to buy their votes. And that is what people find so distasteful about this strategy. They're going to take the $155 and spend it. They're going to go out and buy dinner or pay a bill, pay their phone bill or whatever, but it's certainly not going to have any impact on whether they vote for this government. Alternatively, what it may do is encourage people not to vote for this government. But the other part about the $155, which is interesting, is the number of people that are actually excluded. The government says, look at this, we're giving Nova Scotians back some of their money. We're going to give them a check for $155. It's an indication of what good money managers we are. We think Nova Scotians should get back some of their money. Well, what Nova Scotians are saying is, instead of giving me $155, while I appreciate that $155 is not an insignificant amount, I would rather see you do with it things like repairing the healthcare system, providing more supports in our classrooms for children with special needs, repairing the roads. There's a whole host of things that that Nova Scotians, many Nova Scotians who have talked to me, my constituents and others, would like to see the government invest that money. And that's why we pay taxes, and that's why most Nova Scotians believe they pay taxes. They pool their money together as Nova Scotians, tax-paying Nova Scotians. They elect a government to then deliver the programs and services that we as a population, as a society, decide are important. Anyway, they're giving us back this $155, but as I said, it's 433,000 Nova Scotians of the age to work who file income tax, who make enough money that they can file for income tax or have to file their income tax. Mr. Speaker, there's also 300,000 Nova Scotians of working age, 300,000 of working age Nova Scotians who don't get the $155 because, Mr. Speaker, they don't make enough money. So here, this huge benefit that the government talks about, this great thing that they're doing, giving Nova Scotians back their money and so on, and there's 300,000 Nova Scotians. Let me tell you that there are some people in my constituency, the constituency of Halifax Atlantic, who do not make enough money whereby they have to file for income tax purposes, and they will not be eligible for that $155. So it's like 60% of the population of Nova Scotia are worthy of this little bit of sweetener from the government, but 40% of Nova Scotians don't rate this kind of treat, this kind of largesse, Mr. Speaker. So, when you think about returning benefits to Nova Scotians, the government are distinguishing between the deserving and the undeserving. And of course, once again, the hands of this government, the undeserving tend to be the most unfortunate, the ones who are earning the lowest incomes in the province of Nova Scotia. So that's the $155. There's also provision that there will be a 10% income tax cut in January of 2004. Once again, Mr. Speaker, I just talked about 433,000 Nova Scotians who file for income tax, 300,000 who don't. So in order to get a 10% tax cut, a 10% cut on your income tax, you therefore have to be a filer. So again, those 300,000 Nova Scotians are not going to be eligible for this tax cut that the government has announced with such fanfare. And of the 433,000 who are eligible for the 10% tax cut, you know, and I know, Mr. Speaker, that it's the ones near the top, the small percentage of maybe 5 to 10% of those 433,000 that are actually going to recognize any difference in the tax that they pay. The people who are close to the 300,000 are going to recognize it in terms of cents and in terms of dollars as they move up the income stream, Mr. Speaker. So, again, this government is setting up two classes of Nova Scotians: the deserving, those that are making more money, and the undeserving, those people who don't earn enough money even to file income tax and who make increasing amounts of money but will receive less and less from this government. So those are the consequences. That's a consequence of two of the big parts of this government's budget, the 155 and the 10% tax cut. And let's remember the other side of that equation, and that is that there's going to be, this represents over $200 million in lost revenue. In lost revenue to the government of Nova Scotia. Revenue that will not be available to pay for the programs and services that are already in desperate shape in the province of Nova Scotia. So invariably, it's people who don't earn enough to file to be in a position to file an income tax form, Mr. Speaker, and those that are just above the threshold, people referred to as the working poor families in the province of Nova Scotia, who are going to be doubly affected. Not only are they not part of the deserving class that this government has set up, but they are also going to be further punished by being part of not only undeserving in terms of not getting any benefits from the tax cut, but undeserving in that their programs or the programs and services that many of them depend on are going to be cut, are going to be reduced even further. So let me look at some of the issues again in Halifax Atlantic, and certainly there are those, or many of those, and those 300,000, and some of those people at the lower end of the income scale who do file income tax that are going to be affected in Halifax Atlantic, Mr. Speaker. But who else? You know, what else does this budget actually deal with? Does this budget, and through the Financial Measures Act, does this budget actually allow the government to pay a fair wage to the women and men who work as counselors in small options homes for employers such as RRSS, Mr. Speaker? Does it permit the government to provide a fair wage and to properly support these programs, Mr. Speaker, for the intellectually disabled? Well, I think you and I know the answer to that. All we got to do is listen to what's going on outside this chamber. And we listen day in and day out now for 3 weeks to women and men who have given their lives to the service of the less fortunate, the most vulnerable in our society, and they have basically watched while this government has thumbed their noses at them and the people that they serve. So this government